Good evening and warm welcome to all of you here and our guest here. Thank you for accepting our invitations. And my name is Firuza Farvardin. I am kind of delighted to co-moderate this event along with my comrade and colleague Boris Nehe, that also is coordinating international research group on authoritarianism and counter strategies. You may heard the name, IRGAC, that actually organized this event tonight. You may want to say some words about introduce the IRGAC, and then we will start with our panelists. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Also, welcome. Good evening to this first day of spring from my side. Very happy to be here, very happy to have you on board here and that all of you came. So just a quick note on what we're doing. The International Research Group on Authoritarianism and Counter Strategies was founded by the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung and is still a project by Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung and now also at Potsdam University. We are bringing together activist researchers from the so-called Global South or Global Majority, and we are looking at kind of the entanglements of, let's call it authoritarianism, from a post-colonial southern perspective to understand kind of what are the parallels, what are the differences when we look at the unpleasant things that we are seeing happening around the world. And that, of course, also brings us to one important point that, as you have seen, we're talking of fascist pleasures and authoritarianism, which was kind of one key concept that we were using, or that we still are using, a couple of years ago. Like, we have been working together for, I think, 6 or 7 years now. There is kind of a transition, and I mean, it was already kind of scary and frightening what we were looking at a couple of years ago, but we were still, like, people were talking about right-wing populism, authoritarianism, and so on and so forth. But now, the claim that this is fascism is not, we can see using this word is a lot more common nowadays, which is not actually a very good sign, of course. And there is a question of what is new from what is happening. I mean, what is new if we look at the last 15 years, the last 20 years, but also what is actually new now in these kind of last 3 years that we see a change of vibe, mood, and so on. I would say, of course, it has to do with the second term of Trump and US politics. But it also has to do with the genocide in Gaza. It also has to do with what is happening just a month ago in Iran, what is happening like around the world. There's like something which is breaking apart, which of course has to do kind of with this rules-based international order, with a liberal statehood and liberal rights. I think it is important to mention that also liberal statehood was not beautiful at all, and this rights-based order was always something that was valid for a small part of the planet, and for most part it was not. Anyways, we are seeing that there is something changing, and we want to look at what is changing there, what is happening beyond this kind of geopolitical part, also beyond of what is happening. It's not detached, but it's beyond of what is happening also kind of in the state, in the political practices, in the institutions, where we see a lot of changes, but there's also something which is maybe even more difficult to grasp, more difficult to understand, which is kind of vibe shift, or a shift in the mood, or a shift that something is like unhinged or de-sublimated, which we are seeing around the world. And this is where we try to look at on this kind of social dimensions, on the affects that are like floating around and finding new kind of political expressions.
Yeah, what I can take from here is that, it's not just about state fascism. It's not just about authoritarian leaders that we are here talking about, or censorship or authoritarianism in general, but also about embodied experience, how is felt in the body and emotions and desires. So, but when we also think through this aspect from the dimension of affective or emotional aspect, basically most of the time we're thinking about resentment, hate, I don't know, this kind of sad passions, I would say that. But, or fear. I think fear is also one of the most important ones that everyone kind of mentioned. But what if fascism is not just about fear or hatred, also about pleasure, about joy, about transgression? So this is the things that we're trying to see, how the fascism mobilize enjoyment, play, hope, love, and it's kind of, as I think some of your works is kind of address the transgression and being anti-systematic in a sense. So across very different contexts, digital cultures, gender politics, I don't know, libertarian populism, that we will go to talk about that, we are seeing the forms of politics that present themselves as rebellious and anti-systematic, playful, joyful, even liberating in a sense. So tonight we want to ask these questions. What does contemporary fascism produce? Pleasure. What kind of desires does it organize? How does freedom and liberty itself become a vehicle of domination and exploitations? And what does it mean to resist not only the violence of the fascism, but the enjoyment and pleasure in it? So each of our panelists approaches these ideas from a very distinct angle, but with a striking resonance, I would say that. So without further ado, let me introduce the first panelist, and I will now return to Eva Majewska. Eva Majewska is a philosopher, feminist theorist, and political activist based now in Berlin and Warsaw. She works as an associate professor at SWPS University in Warsaw and has been affiliated with prominent international institutions like ICI in Berlin and Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. Majewska's research focuses on critical theory, feminist philosophy, anti-fascist cultures, and the politics of affect and resistance. Eva is the author of Feminist Anti-Fascism, Counterpublics of the Commons, published by Verso in 2021, a foundational work that reframes anti-fascist politics through the lens of feminist theory and collective counterpublics. In addition to her extensive academic work, Eva has a long history of activism. She has been involved in anarchist, anti-border, ecologist, and queer feminist movement in Poland, and she has been active in various civic and political roles. Her public intervention and essays regularly appear in international forums and journals like eFlags, Science, and Jacobin, where she connects feminist critical theory with pressing struggles against authoritarianism, gender violence, and far-right resurgence. Eva's today input is titled, and actually she kind of changed it, so Misogyny, the Perversion of Fascism and Tautologies of Authoritarian Love. Eva will elaborate in her 12 minutes to 15 minutes talk on misogyny. Is not just one hatred among others, but actually a structural effect of the core of fascism. So, Eva, your argument, as far as I understand, is based on your previous works where you discuss the dialect of love of sameness and the violent rejection of otherness, and also, in a sense, heterogeneity. I'm basically very curious to know how the love of sameness ended up to fascist misogyny. So, floor is yours, please.
Thank you you so much, and I'm sorry for this little delay in answering. Thank you for having me, and thank you for coming here. I think this is a paradoxical situation. We are gathered to discuss pleasures, but it's not nice, right? I don't know if you have this. I have an enormous frustration because, you know, publishing this book, Feminist Antifascism, which I advertise, and thank you for mentioning it, gave me a lot of this kind, you know, there is this academic satisfaction when you predict something and then it happens. So when I was, you know, since 2005, I've been reclaiming the necessity of discussing fascism, not populism, not post or neo or whatever else, but fascism as it is, or at least fascization. If somebody was not open to the concept of fascism, I was suggesting, okay, fascization. And I was using Carl Schmitt's doctrine of the state of exception as the general pattern for fascization. And in Poland, it worked like that. Also, Polish former president and former prime minister counted among their advisors the translators and proponents of Carl Schmitt. So basically, it was really direct. They were copying, you know, from partisan theory, from other books of Schmitt, they were copying the solutions that have been working, unfortunately, very well in fascist Germany earlier. So somehow the closeness of this experience was really huge. But so I was thinking, obviously, as an anti-fascist activist and theorist, I was thinking for many years that there is no pleasure attached to this fascist belonging, that it's like sacrificial, basically. And there is a part of that is sacrificial, but sacrificial, as we know from psychoanalysis, does not necessarily mean deprived of pleasure. It can actually be incredibly pleasurable, and I cannot. I have 12 minutes, so I'm going to just signalize, you know, points, because otherwise we would sit here till tomorrow, and other speakers would not be able to talk. But obviously, so basically, I was deprived of this book, Feminist Antifascism. I was deprived of this pleasure. I was right, because it's very difficult to, you know, to enjoy this, like, I was right kind of moment when it's about fascism coming in, as you predicted. It's like, so I'm, you know, I have one more reason to hate fascism somehow, which is basically I can't enjoy, you know, the failure of my work in this case. So that's another, you know, it's like, but there is personal dimension to it as well as theoretical. So as a theorist and as a feminist activist, also and queer activist, I have always been thinking of fascism as incredibly, as promoting this, you know, cultural heroic masculinity to an extent that is like, excessive, basically. I'm not sure if this is working. Yes. Yeah. So I've been thinking of fascism as this rejection of the feminine. And now, in the time of transphobia and the brutality of rejection of trans persons and intersexual persons and other persons that do not fit strictly in the binary scenario, I have to say that when I say misogyny, I do not mean essentialist approach to it. I do not mean like cis women and their attributes. What I mean is the cultural feminine, which I perceive as an attribute that we can also see projected in a negative way onto, for instance, colonized people, racialized people. The structure of racism has a lot to do, I think, with misogyny, in the sense that the racialized others are perceived as having the feminine characteristics, so being irrational as opposed to the white hegemonic, supposedly rational subject of Europe, or being weak, or being embodied and sensual, like as if, you know, the white heterosexual hegemonic masculinity was not embodied, etc., etc., etc. So this component of I call it femininity still, cultural femininity, you could say. In a beautiful book, Trans Femmes Futures, from Raha and van der Drift, there is this notion of femness. So they explore, they speak of femness, like femme butch in the lesbian classics, let's say. So they create this concept of femness, which I like very much. However, it is, to me, it is too strongly linked to solely queer identity. So I'm using femininity, which on the other hand is too much linked. I mean, I would choose something in between these two, yeah. But it's easier for me also to speak about femininity for now. Also, it is more familiar. So rhetorically, you know, if I want to explain my perspective on fascism, it's easier to speak about femininity as easier for everyone to immediately catch the grasp. So I'm thinking that the fascist passions and pleasures are diverse. So I think there are pleasures that come directly with expressing the hegemonic position. So enjoyment of power, enjoyment of heroism. This is one type of pleasures. But I believe that there is more to it. And I think we need to think about the year 1968 as, on one hand, the accumulation of leftist, progressive, anti-authoritarian desires and conceptualizations thereof. But also, I think, the fascists learn at that moment that the position of bad boy is actually something that allows the propagation, the promotion of ultra-right-wing ideas generally. So the bad boy position becomes an important one within the fascist imaginary. And as we see today, all those guys that are depicted in the Epstein files, many of them I would call fascists straight away, or at least enjoying the fascist privileges. So I would speak of Prince Andrew, for instance, as perhaps not somebody who claims to be a Nazi, a fascist, a believer in this specific political doctrine. However, he had been in whatever violations he committed, or he's accused of still now, but it's quite probable, I think, that he might have committed them. See how legally prepared I came to this gathering. so in this person, we can see expressions of fascist privilege executed, unfortunately, on entire generations of young women, and this commodification of women in the Epstein files, I think, is a good example of how in fascist era it is possible to commodify the bodies once again. And the specific bodies, the bodies that are or can be seen as feminine. So there is the pleasure of enjoying the power, the authoritarian power. There is the pleasure also of enjoying another person's, for instance, our leader's enjoyment. So there is this more closeted version of fascist pleasure, which is more on the suffering side, let's say. Like, I can't be this alpha male, but my leader can. So therefore, there is like a set of projections and investments that is more complex than just identifying or directly enjoying. But this indirect enjoyment, of course, happens a lot. And I believe this is like, watching all those powerful men expressing their liberty to grab another woman, to invade another person's country. When you were enumerating the fascist leaders, I was thinking of Putin. I was thinking of Putin so much because in 2007, the Russian Parliament Duma declared the domestic violence, the more radical versions of domestic violence, not banned by law. So they took it away from the criminal code. So that means you can batter your wife freely at home. Right? And this is, like, Russia is an enormous country. It's a huge country with many millions of people living in there. And domestic violence, I mean, it has been diagnosed to be one of the more violent places for women, unfortunately, since many decades, not just now. But then, so the war in Ukraine is, I think, partially also an expression of the hatred from Putin to this more liberal, and here I'm kind of contradicting what you just said, more liberal Ukrainian society in which the LGBTQ cause, it doesn't matter so much whether the hatred is directed, and this is what makes it also very universal, very global, as a tool to understand the pleasures of fascists and fascism as such. This misogyny is a common denominator which is transcultural. It is everywhere. So then certain elements of this kind of hatred and this kind of affect. Because it's, on one hand, like we have seen in male fantasies of Klaus Teweleit, how fascists have fetishized certain versions of femininity and either cherished them as the good mother, as the virgin, as the old woman, caring old woman. So there was this accepted version of femininity, but there was the wild red Jewish communist. And that was the symbol, I would say, for the femininity that fascists didn't like. However, they might enjoy it. And this is what we see also today in the popular culture, especially, and in all those various images of femininity that might be chaste, but might also be ultra sexualized, vulgar, and otherwise different. So to summarize my points, because I should finish, right? I have 5 more minutes. Jesus, I'm so stressed. Okay, so that's even better. So femininity as a resource, I would say. In fascism, it is reduced to a resource. In other political doctrines, political positions, I think it is seen often in better way. Maybe not by neoliberal capitalism, which also reifies it and capitalizes on it brutally and I would say vulgarly also, if you can say that. But for fascism, femininity is this resource that can be divided, conquered, used, abused, from which a lot of pleasure can be taken, obviously. And then if we see femininity as this resource, it becomes an attribute of women, obviously, but also of colonized persons, of people with racialized, and racialization, as we know, proceeds in different ways. So here it would be probably white people's hegemony and other, but then in other regions of the world it takes different forms. No, we have also white-to-white racism in Poland, for instance. When we see a Ukrainian person speaking Ukrainian, many people are like, "Oh, these are not exactly white persons or something." So in Germany, Polish immigrants have the same observations very often, right? It's like, okay, white person, but a kind of less white person or something. So we have those versions of racism, but there is also ethnic conflicts, based on completely other principles. So this femininity as a resource, I'm thinking now about the LGBTQA plus persons, because here this attribution of femininity is more complex, right? But what happens there? What happens there is, I think that these people, this group, is challenging the binary division that is at the core of even speaking of femininity, right? So the LGBTQA plus persons might still be attributed femininity as a resource and oppressed by fascists, and that happens as well. But I think the fear that is related, and also the pleasures that are related, unfortunately, to that specific group from the perspective of fascism, is that basically they challenge this binary division. So they work as an object, you can say, based on Julia Kristeva's analysis of the subject formation and the construction of that, which is not yet object, but also not anymore the subject. The object, the one that is similar to me, so similar that it's scary to see how different this person might be, right? So for a straight man, a gay guy who is dressed like him, looks like him, behaves like him, and also is a CEO in a large company, for instance, is the most scary person. So that would be the logic of Kristeva. I think it's not a bad one, and we can use it. But also, I mean, and more importantly, I think Judith Butler is a theorist that comes to mind here, because it is they who have been speaking extensively about the hatred, the violence against LGBTQA plus people and trans people more recently, as a particular characteristic of today's fascism. And I believe them. I think that is incredibly important. And what Butler were writing much earlier in the 90s still, in Gender Trouble, for instance, about the LGBTQA plus and the fear, the violence that these groups awake in heteronormative society, is that the LGBTQA plus persons challenge the binary, the very possibility of extracting femininity and exploiting those who are producing it, who are generating it, who are expressing and performing it. So I think that allows still using the misogyny as a particular characteristic on the side of fascism, also to explain homophobia, transphobia, and these phobias, right? So I think I'm going to stop here, and thank you for your attention, and I'll pass it on to further speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eva. you argues actually
No, go.
Fascism organized misogyny in a kind of, at the end of your talk, a kind of productive, constitutive ways. But now we can ask that what kind of economic and social order produce subjects that is kind of ready and prepared for this affective formation that you're talking about? Is there something about the contemporary capitalism, especially it's in digital and financialized form, that prepare us for this kind of affective politics that you a bit talk about, that misogynist aspect? And I guess Max has an interesting insight on that. Max's input title is The Rise of the Playground, Fascistic Violence in Game Capitalism. So, but before your talk, let me introduce you, Max. Max Haven is a writer, teacher, public intellectual, and cultural organizer whose works span academic research, public writing, game design, and political education. He is currently Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair in the Radical Imagination at Lakehead University in Canada, where he also directs the Reimagining Value Lab, that is a kind of research hub focusing on building collective capacity for systematic change. Wow. It's a very interesting topic. Max's scholarly works and books have long explored the intersection of the capitalism, culture, art, and social movements. In recent years, specifically Marx turned to the question of Max. Yeah, the same. It doesn't not that. Yeah, of the 21st century. Of how capitalism, game logic interact with contemporary politics, especially in the rise of far-right and extremist movement. His forthcoming book, that is not yet, I think, come out, is Player and Played from Game Capitalism to 21st Century's Fascism, that will come hopefully soon by MIT Press, examines how financialized capitalism reshape social subjectivities into competitive players. Beyond writing, of course, Marx, like Eva, is known for activism and combining critical theory with creative practice. He's a designer of the board game, and recently the ones that is come out is Billionaire and Guillotines, as you can see, published by Pluto Press, and we had the chance and pleasure of playing it actually yesterday night in a workshop. Max also leads several workshop and podcast series that explores the themes on conspiracies, cultures, media power, games, and social movement. So Max, you are going to talk about playground. That is a concept that I would like to kind of know more about. That is how it's connected to fascist violence. And you kind of argue that it's not just ideological, but also a playful, or better to say, gameful and deeply shaped by the subjectivities formed under gamified capitalism. So could you walk us through how you see these connections and a bit, elaborate on the concept of the playgrounds that you mentioned?
Yes, and thank you. It's very nice to be here with you all. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you all for coming. I think in these times like this, it's nice to be in a room of people who are anti-fascists and thinking about what we should do next in a serious way. Yes, as mentioned, my new book, which is in copy editing right now, should be out this summer, hopefully, is called The Player and the Played: From Gamed Capitalism to 21st Century Fascism. And a kind of central piece in that book is this chapter on what I call the playgrom, which is a portmanteau of play and pogrom. And I don't do that to fail to take the pogrom seriously as an act of fascistic violence. And I'll speak a little bit about why I use the adjective fascistic in a moment. I do take pogroms extremely seriously, but I think what I want to do in that chapter, as part of the whole book, is to say that fascism now in the 21st century, and its 21st century formations, is much more playful than its 20th century ancestor. And we need to understand its playfulness if we're going to understand both how seductive it is and how it has become seductive, how it's related to capitalism, and what we might do to fight it. And I wanted to begin this presentation by just telling you a little bit about the conceptual framework I had to build for this book, because I find in rooms like this, famously, a person I rarely quote because I don't like his work, but he had a very good point about fascism. Ortega y Gasset, to paraphrase, said, like, what do you do with fascism that is always both A and not A at the same time? Anything you say about fascism, you can also say its opposite. And that's partly because, to quote another anti-fascist thinker, Sartre, fascism defines itself by its declaration of a right to play. It's a beautiful phrase that he has that I'm still trying to track down the source of. But I think what I take from those two together is that fascism, because ultimately what it boils down to is the conspicuous worship of cruel power for its own sake, makes a kind of game out of discourse. So anything a fascist says, you can find another fascist who said the opposite. You can find quotes in Mussolini where he contradicts himself from like 2 weeks before. And that's not just because he was a kind of deranged guy. It was because fascism fundamentally is about the joy of transgression as a kind of flex, as a way of demonstrating a kind of supremacy that exceeds discourse and is simply about the power of the individual or the group to dominate, including to dominate words. So that just makes fascism an incredibly difficult thing to talk about and to discuss, and a very difficult thing to fight. So that's one kind of thing that I always try and begin by saying. The second thing is, I think we're struggling between, on the one hand, the reemergence of fascism and actual fascists who believe fascist things and say fascist things, and with a nod and a wink, demonstrate to us that they have read Carl Schmitt, that they are quoting Hitler, that they are quoting Mussolini, and they're doing so gladly. And then we have another phenomenon which is connected, which is what I call fascistic politics. And this is maybe closer to what Umberto Eco talked about as fascism, the kind of ideological substrate of fascism that fascist ideology in its explicit form builds on, but that also percolates society much more generally. And then in between these two, in between like explicit fascism and fascistic politics, we have the process that Eva mentioned a moment ago of fascization, of the way that social institutions, social discourse, and culture are taken over by both fascistic politics and also actual, honest-to-God fascists like Elon Musk and the Trump crew and all those types. And so this led me in the book to try and outline kind of three layers of the fascist cake. Maybe cake, but we're talking about pleasure, so let's say it's a cake. So on the one hand, we have like manifest fascism, like explicit fascist ideology, which comes in a lot of flavors and a lot of varieties. Sometimes it announces itself as the worship of the nation, but other times it announces itself as a worship of the markets. Sometimes it announces itself as the worship of military force. Sometimes it announces itself as the worship of masculinity. Sometimes these things are combined. Sometimes they break apart. Fascists can't be trusted necessarily to even give an earnest or honest or coherent account of themselves. So you have these kind of manifest fascist ideologies. And then on another layer, you might think about what has been called like incipient fascism, or what I term in the book latent fascism. And this, I think, is what our more liberal friends or frenemies who consider themselves anti-fascists often forget, which is that beyond just the people who call themselves fascists, the fact is that liberal democratic capitalism, so-called, for the last 75 years or more, has depended on pockets of fascism within it, both on the international scene and within domestic capitalist liberal economies. On an international scene, the international world order that apparently fell apart in the last few years with Trump depended on installing fascist dictators all around the world in order to secure the profitability of capitalist corporations. And from Korea to Guatemala, from all around the world, we've seen the CIA and other groups try and contain the threat of communism and also ensure the profitability of corporations and the stability of the liberal capitalist world order through the selective imposition of fascism in different places. At the same time, those liberal capitalist countries have also depended on creating pockets of fascism within them to control unruly or surplus populations. And here is an analysis I'm bringing in from Angela Davis and George Jackson and others in the black radical tradition in the United States, who point out that like fascism it was alive and well in the United States in the form of the Ku Klux Klan, but also in the form of the prison system and the police system. It is active in the corporate structures which place, corporate profits in a position of incredible life and death power over people. All of these forms of fascism have to exist within capitalism in order for capitalism to function. So the second layer is to admit that actually capitalism and fascism, even though they might declare themselves opponents, actually reinforce one another. And then a third layer is to think about what, for the last maybe 50 years, has been termed like micro-fascism. And this is, to put it poetically, the little fascist within each of us. And the way that fascism already builds on the systems of domination that long predate capitalism and long predate fascism. For instance, patriarchy, transphobia, racism, xenophobia, etc. All of those tendencies within us which make us worship power, that make us desire power over and domination, that build on systems of exploitation and domination of other people. Okay, that's the framework of the book in general. So that then allows me to think about what are the contemporary forms of fascist violence and how have they become playful. And in the book, I take up an argument that's made by many others, which is to say that, like, fascism, again, in contradistinction to our liberal frenemies, fascism is not just the resurgence of, authoritarianism and tyranny, which have long plagued humanity across many civilizations. Fascism, if it means anything at all, is the sickening of capitalism on its own waste. It is what happens when capitalism eats its own shit and vomits, to be crude about it. It is what happens when a system of exploitation and domination begins to produce its own crisis and then starts to propose ever more violent solutions to the crisis that it creates. And I think from that perspective, we would need to see fascism as bearing a family resemblance in many ways to the same capitalism that gives birth to it. And my argument in the book is that the type of capitalism that we're living in right now is gamed capitalism. It's a capitalism that has been gamified, not only in terms of the incredible power and profits of the video game and game industry, which is considerable. It is the largest entertainment industry to have ever existed in human history. 3 billion people, by some estimates, play a game, a commercially mediated game each day. It is larger than the film and television, music, and publishing industry all combined. So video games are very, very important in this. But that's not exactly what I'm talking about in this book. I'm talking about something else as well, which is the way that this form of capitalism, after 40 years of neoliberalism and financialization, feels to most people like an unwinnable game they've been forced to play. Hence the incredible popularity of Squid Game, of the Hunger Games, these sort of parables of being trapped in a game you can't win, forced to compete with everyone else. But the problem here is not, and some of these these fables are quite important for thinking through anti-fascism and anti-capitalism. But the problem is that under those 40 years of financialization, we've all been habituated to take on a kind of subjectivity of the player, of the kind of agent who seizes their own possibility and activates themselves as an entrepreneur and investor in every walk of life. The example I often give is of students in universities who used to be hailed by the state as future citizens. Now you're simply hailed by the university as an investor in your own education, in the maximization of your human capital, in the interests of competing with your fellow investors, maybe to get a job in the future. But so if we've all been asked to become players now in this economy, we all feel that we've fundamentally been played, that we've been cheated. And unfortunately, rather than look up the socioeconomic ladder for the real cheats on the top, who are stashing their money in tax havens and doing their horrible deeds on their private islands, public anger is focused by fascistic forces downwards on what are imagined to be the cheats at the bottom. The welfare or social benefits recipient who's allegedly cheating on their taxes, the the migrant who crosses the border outside of the rules, who is apparently cheating the meritocratic border system. So, and this happens somehow, this kind of arranging of a fascist imaginary around this idea of the abject cheat, while at the same time, across all of the different national examples we could speak about tonight, the fascists in power are themselves explicitly and conspicuously cheats as well. People who cheat constantly at elections, on their taxes, in business, in life, on their spouses, etc. And they cheat with a nod and a wink, because to cheat publicly and get away with it is a kind of fascist flex. It demonstrates a kind of power that hails followers as something, as a kind of pleasurable intercourse. At the same time as we may have that emerging, I also think we can look to games and the cultures around games to understand how fascistic politics and new forms of fascism are taking a very different form than their 20th century precedent. If we look only to the 20th century precedent here in Germany or in Italy or in Japan, we would look explicitly for a kind of centralized, top-down, militaristic organization of fascist parties and fascist entities. And I think what we need to look to instead is a kind of disorganized, much more chaotic, much more playful expression of fascist politics. So in that chapter on the playground, I look to, for instance, the Gamergate controversy that happened and swarming that happened about 10 years ago, where gamers sort of assembled in a leaderless mob on the internet to wage war against people they considered to be in a feminist conspiracy against video game culture. And this was organized through kind of the structures of the internet, a sort of decentralized, horizontalist expression of what I term a kind of 20th century pogrom, a kind of mass violence orchestrated against a targetable minority, not only for political purposes, but also for a kind of sadistic collective pleasure. Another example I look at in that chapter is the Christchurch massacre in 2019, where 50 Muslims were gunned down at prayer and in a community center by someone who live streamed the massacre as if it were a first-person shooter video game. But not only that, live streamed it to a community of people who cheered him on and gave him points within their own chat rooms to reward him for his murders as well. But I think we can also look at this kind of gamification of fascist violence in, for instance, the new kinds of provocative fascist tactics that are being employed. I was at a presentation a couple of weeks ago by someone speaking about here in Germany, the kind of fascist influencers who get up in front of a group of people in a town square and just begin to spout Islamophobic bile as a way of awakening a kind of response that they can then capture on social media and recycle as a way to build more followers. This is, again, a kind of like fascist game that uses themes, both technologically mediated themes of decentralization, but also this kind of nod and a wink, where the fascism is both hidden and transparent at the same time. Okay, I think I want to close it there because I'm running out of time, but maybe I would just say one last thing, which is, I think there's a temptation that I often get when I give these presentations where people are like, oh yeah, that means that we on the left, we anti-fascists need to be more playful. And as a game designer, I'm not against that, but anti-fascism is no joke, you know. It's really hard, and it's very dangerous. So I don't want to diminish that. And I think that while we can engage with playfulness and make our movements more joyful and more fun, that in and of itself is not going to solve the problem. What I think we can learn from games and play has much more to do with how can we make people feel like agents rather than so-called NPCs in their lives. And even in our movements, non-player characters, those kind of characters you engage with in a video game. I think what the far right has been extremely successful in doing is hailing people and inviting them into participatory spectacles. The pleasure of fascism now is not just, you know, attending the rally and, you know, looking adoringly up at the Führer. It is now actually becoming an active participant in something that makes you feel like finally for once in your life you're a real player. the player you were always supposed to be, the player you've been prepared and trained to be under this moment of gamed capitalism. And if we want to succeed both in keeping and maintaining our movements, but also reaching out to more people, I think we can think much more generally about how we give people a sense of agency that makes them feel not like they're just dedicating themselves to a lost cause, but actually building something that they feel they have some real power to change reality with.
Thank you, Max. You have already answered the question and I have in mind for the second round, but yeah, maybe we can dig in it later. But then to connect to our third speaker, I would like actually start it from the same place, that how in a real, state project or political ideology, this kind of playfulness has a rule. How is translated in this players' rules and logic of competitiveness and outsourcing risk that we have in logic of the game, translated and practices in real project. And I think nowhere better than, unfortunately or fortunately in Argentina under Javier Milei, we can see this. So that brings me to introduce Gustavo Robles. And the title of your input is, if I'm not wrong, The Dark Pleasure of Libertarian Freedom. And let me first introduce you, and then our floor is yours. So, Gustavo is a philosopher and activist from Argentina. He's currently Goethe Henkel postdoctoral fellow at the University of Passau, Germany, and a research fellow, again, also part of the IRGAC. Gustavo research sits at the intersection of critical theory and the political economy of digital capitalism, with a particular focus on how libertarian and ultra-right movements mobilize technological imaginaries, anti-state rhetoric, and platform economies. Gustavo's analysis on Latin American libertarianism highlight how tech utopian narratives function as both economic strategy but also as political myth, enabling kind of authoritarian or fascistic tendency to present themselves as emancipatory, or put it in what Max said, that feeling agent, being an agent. Beyond academia, Gustavo is also deeply engaged in activist practice. He coordinates the Picatero University project of popular education in Tucumán, his hometown in northern Argentina, a grassroots initiative rooted in social movement traditions that seeks to build collective political knowledge beyond the institutional framework. So, Gustavo, your your works basically is about the relationship between platform, algorithm, governance, and libertarian ideology, that you're basically arguing that digital capitalism produce new sense of freedom that kind of blurred the lines between autonomy and exploitations. So I'm very eager to know, how do you understand and connect this appeal of Milei's libertarian project with the fascist framing of freedom? Yeah. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Fido. Thank you very much for the invitation. And it's really a pleasure to come after Eva and Mas. And so I hope to live up them. So actually, my presentation, I wrote some notes. I will focus more on a case because I come from Argentina. Argentina in capitalist term is the past, like as undeveloped capitalist or periphery. But in fascist term is the future. I come from the future, kind of with very, very bad news. Actually, I wrote some notes, so I will read a little bit and try combine with the speaking, but I won't bore you because I also prepared some kind of picture, and actually my talk is about that picture, so I will try to explain that picture. I will try to reflect on that picture because I think that picture is in the core of, let's say, the fascist pleasure, or what I want to say, how libertarian, how fascists are making austerity sexy. That's the thing. In 2023, so I will start with this with that year. It's a kind of difficult for me, to speak here in English about things that I always to speak in Spanish, not only because of the language, but also because of kind of, shared knowledge or sensibility or whatever. So I would like to make me explain. So what made me clear, understood? You know, in 2022, so that was the year, so I would like to go back to that year. Javier Milei to the stage, you know, as the new Argentinian president, it was really a surprise. And in his opening speech, he pronounced 4 words, so no hay plata, which is there is no money. And he received a big applause, and this no plata became a slogan. There were a lot of, I don't know, t-shirt, merchandises about that. It became rapidly the motto of the libertarian government, this idea of no hay plata. And my idea is how that was possible, you know, so my idea so my title is about that. Also, it's not only about the images, but it's also about the reaction to that image. How the slogan "No hay plata" became sexy, you know. That is something I would like to explore. First of all, I would like to reject the thesis of fascistization of society, as people have finally removed their mask, you know, to reveal the fascist faith they always have. You know, because I don't think that fascists were like that. You know, fascists not the, let's say, the hidden essence behind democratic facade, but it's not the opposite to democratic, you know, society. It's more complex than that. Fascism is, I will define, the target activation of certain intensity, of certain feelings that already run through the social body. More concretely, what fascism does is identify the emotional fault lines of social suffering, locating wounds and pressing on them hard enough that pain turns into pleasure. You know, Milei's great achievement was that, you know, to make austerity sexy and to turn Argentina into a laboratory for that. So Milei's great achievement was to convert sacrifice into collective pleasure. This is the enigma locked inside this no hay plata, and I want to talk about that. Argentina in 2023 was a society that had run out of road, you know. After the pink tide crisis, the society had gradually curdled into something harder to name than simpler crisis. It's more a prolonged, cumulative, and greater exhaustion. By the end of 2023, every economy indicator was in red, you know. Average monthly wage had fallen to $300. Annual inflation was running at almost 200% and accelerating. 44% of the population lived below the poverty line. The peso is the national currency, had been devaluated by almost 80% in a single year. GDP had contracted, foreign reserves were depleted, and the external debt was crashing. That was the context of Milei, you know, where Milei became president. But numbers rarely capture what matters most, the texture of daily life under condition of permanent deterioration. The experience of watching salaries dissolve, of calculating which pill to skip this month, of updating supermarket prices every week, yet of this produced something specific, not only anger, but a particular mixture of desire for change and resignation. I mean, the feeling that something has to change, the desire for change, but at the same time, the conviction that nothing will change. You know, this contradictory feeling. Milei and the libertarians, or Milei agenda, was the political compromise between those contradictory feelings. You know, it represents both the urgency for change, the desire for change, and the awareness of its impossibility, the amalgam of protest and skepticism, of rapture drives and resignation. You know? In this emotional climate, Milei's election was not an uprising, but something similar to an uprising. Argentina has a long tradition of uprising. You know? What happened in 2023 was something different, a silent protest, but by a demobilized society, a rebellion of people too busy working multiple jobs to do activism, too tired to protest, who found in the vote, you know, the most anonymous, detached, and quantitative method that democracy offers us to say enough. I want to call this a social implosion, not an explosion. Implosion is a kind of explosion that doesn't explode, you know, but collapse inward, collapse in our body, in our subjectivity, in our feelings. We imagine the classical political form of revolution as kind of outburst, a kind of uprising, of an explosion. But what happened there was an implosion. It's the opposite. The form that revolt takes in exhausted and precarized bodies. The implosion is not apathy. It's quite the opposite. It's the rebellion of the overworker. It's the rebellion of people who don't have time to rebel because they are working. And fascists today moves better within private implosion than within collective uprisings. To understand what Millet offers to this exhausted body, I want to sketch an schematic periodization of neoliberalism because it makes sense. In the early years, in the mid-70s, in the mid-80s, neoliberalism understood itself as a form of combat. It's a central. His central figure, or the central figure of this early neoliberalism, was the warrior, the war, the cowboy in Ronald Reagan, the Iron Lady in Margaret Thatcher, or the general in Pinochet. Neoliberalism has to fight against welfare state, against collective imaginary, against unions, against communists, against socialists, against social movement, whatever. Has to fight. The ethos was a kind of martial, we can call that combative neoliberalism. In the 90s it was different. The battle was historical one, and the victor opened a second phase, the utopian and hedonistic neoliberalism of the 90s. The year of the end of history, the year of cosmopolitan liberalism, economic globalization, techno-optimism, and whatever. The neoliberalism promised that structural reform will deliver open society, efficient economy, happy individuals, efficient democracies, whatever. The hero shifted from warrior to the hedonist, from cowboy to the bon vivant, let's say, from fighting to enjoying. But what happened? This hedonist neoliberalism is over, and we can date his death in the 2000 crisis. The crisis demonstrated that neoliberalism illusion was exactly that, an illusion. What came after that was a technocratic rhetoric, embedded with sacrifice and guilt. Pay your debt, fighting your battle, work harder. The problem, according to this narrative, was our laziness, or lack of discipline, let's say, and a quasi-religious language of self-purification was connected with this kind of technocratic discourse based on austerity and asceticism. But the problem with this kind of, let's call it sacrifice neoliberalism, is that sacrifice demands that neoliberalism demand keep growing, always demand more sacrifice and more sacrifice, while the rewards keep receding. How do you ask for more effort from people who have already given everything when no one of the promised returns has materialized? That is the problem. And the libertarian fascists found the answer for that, by converting sacrifice into enjoyment, by transforming sacrifice in pleasure, let's say. This is the innovation this is what Millet proposed, It represents a new phase of the mutation in capital ideology. The chainsaw is the symbol of the alchemist transformation. Maybe you can. Here lies the pleasure targeted by the aesthetic cruelty, the celebration of, fighting public workers, cutting pensions, police repression, stigmatization of union and social movement, and whatever. This austerity as enjoyment has the advantage of being self-reinforcing, For austerity to become enjoyable, need to be brutal, need to be beyond all proportion, need to be excessive, need to be spectacular, If you do kind of normal adjustment, it's kind of gray technocratic stuff that we already know. But what Millet is proposing is kind of a brutal adjustment. Millet himself gave the most clear account of this logic when he boasted, this is a quotation, "We made the biggest adjustment in the history of humanity, and we haven't lost a single point of social support." The remark was not a boast about economic management, it was a boast about libidinal management. This hyperbole brings about a mixture of horror and fascination, and this is what I want to talk about. Do you have the You know? It's a kind of slasher movie, you know, like this idea of adjustment, like hyperbole. Speaking of horror and fascination, Susan Sontag published a short essay in 1975, a very beautiful essay called Fascinating Fascism. It's based on, so dedicated to Leni Riefenstahl cinema, Leni Riefenstahl movie, or aesthetic. And she recognized, Susan Sontag, she recognized that fascist is more sensual than communist. She said that clearly. While left aesthetic tend to be unisex, tend to be realistic, tend to be moralistic, fascist aesthetic poses a clear erotic surface. For Sontag, fascism was sexy because it deployed an utopian, sensual, and idealizing aesthetic. But at the same time, fascists need or had to be sublimated. This vital force need to be sublimated, contained, channeled in the service of a moral vision, of a redemptive ideal. Fascists at the same time, you know, the contention and the sublimation of those vital forces. But today fascists is kind of different. So today fascists still appear more sexy than the realistic and asexual leftist imaginary, say. But fascist aesthetic has changed. Unlike Riefenstahl fascists, or unlike Riefenstahl movies, you know, contemporary fascism is post-utopian. It no longer needs to sublimate, to moralize, to idealize in search of redemption. This is no transcendent ideal. There is no promise of future here. The Milei supporters are invited to enjoy the destruction now, without sublimation, without delay, without redemption. It's an apocalyptic fascism. But the apocalypse we are talking here is not the climate catastrophe, or it's not the Hollywood apocalypse. It is the credit card limit, you know. It's the expired contract or the salary that doesn't cover the rent. Apocalypse means not the end of the war, but the end of the month. So the post-utopian fascism does not need to promise a better war. You know. It offers something more immediately satisfying. The enjoyment of watching others lose the little they have. A collective schadenfreude, we can say, you know. The promise is simple. Since you will not have what you deserve, at least enjoy watching me take away what others have. In the Lacanian sense, there is a kind of jouissance, sorry, the French people here, kind of jouissance at work, you know. So an enjoyment that exceeds simple pleasure and is bounded up with pain at the same time. The cycle life of precarity is anxiety, and fascists know to recognize this anxiety or anxiety. You know, nothing is more totalitarian today than the precarization of life. Milei libertarian offer an ethic for this condition, not a way out, but a way of inhabiting, of enjoying, you know, of accepting it. It turned reality into a slasher film, but without a final or without any final girl to moralize the story. You know? It's no coincidence that Milei constantly presents himself as a lion. You know, the lion is what we must all become to survive the deregulated capitalism that libertarianism proposes. Yeah. So the libertarian subject is not the self-made man as in the classical neoliberalism, but is the survivor, is the lion in a jungle, is the survivor in a permanent state of emergency. To close, So to close, I want to stress the connection between anarcho-capitalism and fascism. By recalling, you know, I already lost a lot of picture, but it's not the problem. I can show the picture. I can also display the picture after that. Maybe you can also play. I want to stress the connection between anarcho-capitalism and fascism because I think that this is the most, you know, the most clear connection in, you know, current Argentinian situation on the current, you know, trend of fascism. By recalling Pasolini's last film, Saló, you know, I feel precisely this film was about fascist pleasure, you know. At one point, in one part of the movie, you know, one of the main characters, the Duke, declared, "We fascists are the only true anarchists." Maybe it's in the other one. "We fascists are the only true anarchists." The meaning of the phrase is clear today. Where traditional anarchists for self-organization without state and historical fascists for state without self-organization, these anarcho-capitalist fascists, or these libertarian fascists, for the generalization of precarity as a form of life. It means disorganization without a state. Argentina today is the laboratory for this experiment. The emotional structure that Milei captured is not a local pathology, but is a global symptom. However, and this is my, like a final say, the more optimistic, like a say, let's say. However, parallel to the chainsaw, parallel to the lion, parallel to the sacrifice, parallel to the enjoyment, parallel to the Schadenfreude, there was, and still there, a kind of demand, maybe less sexy, that can be a condition for an anti-fascist movement, or maybe for an anti-fascist joy. I mean, alongside demand for destruction, there is a demand that expresses itself constantly, a demand for the end of anxiety, a demand for the end of the disorganization of our life. This is not order. This is not a demand for order, in the classical sense. So the liberal state promised to discipline chaos. It's not a demand for order. It's something more intimate. It's the demand for tranquility of a life that holds together. It's about the desire for arbitral control over our life, so that our existence doesn't constantly slip through our fingers, So if fascism is the activation or the targeted activation of social suffering and anxiety, by turning anxiety and suffering into a kind of Schadenfreude, into a kind of enjoyment, then maybe fascism is not only the fight against domination, but the fight for the condition of a dignified life, take back the control over our life, and over our time, to be sexy in the way we wish.
Thank you very much for all of you. It's very interesting and insightful. There are so many things that we can discuss based on your thought. What has come to my mind, actually, there are two things. I would say that one is that the centrality of the forms of spectacular violence in all of your talk, that in different ways is kind of revealed itself. And I would say that also the kind of, all of you also talk about certain form of anti-fascism that is gonna be based on reclaiming agency. In your thought, it's kind of reclaiming life, but it's kind of reclaiming playing differently. And also in your works, also a kind of anti-fascist and feminist counterpublics. I can kind of connect this two together. But as my expertise on gender, I'm kind of more curious on that aspect. So I would start with that I would like to know, based on what you talk about, and also previous, other works you read from you, if we talk about authoritarian love and passion that is based on this love of sameness, then the question is that any forms of anti-fascism that wants to bring a kind of agency, what kind of love it could have? Is it possible to talk about love, anti-fascist love, or what kind of the base of the community or feminist kind of community? How you describe this kind of different forms of, I don't know whether we should call it love or something else, but yeah.
Thank you for the question, but also thank you for my co-panelists for all this food for thought. Basically, I'm really processing everything I've heard. I think that the lesson that we need to take from the lesson Guattari, from this post-structural momentum, from this moment of dismantlement of structures of thinking and also structures of life after the Second World War, as this moment of recognizing that, for me, a scary moment, but also a very reassuring moment, was when I came to read the chapter on refrain from Mille Plateaux of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. It's a fantastic chapter. I seriously recommend it. But in this chapter, it starts with a figure of a child that is scared. You know, there's a scared child that starts singing a lullaby, a ritournelle, you know, the lullaby to themselves, and then the singing, this process of engaging bodily, but also vocally and creatively with themselves, helps the child to get out of this fear and start creating, I could say love, but they say art, but I would think that the origins of love might be very similar as the origins of art, basically. But then they draw two scenarios, a fascist one and a kind of anarchistic, anti-systemic one. So from this moment of fear, and you know, I'm thinking very often, also they claim that this chapter is surprisingly Hegelian. That's the one place in entire Deleuze and Guattari writings, very exciting for me. I grew up in Hegelian kind of, not household, but like university department. So it was very, and I was against this Hegelian legacy, obviously, as a good student should be. But then what happened was that I discovered, you know, Deleuze and Guattari discovering how Hegelian they are, how they see, you know, certain phases of the historical process appearing with a certain gravity, a certain heaviness, a certain certainty, basically, and that was scary. So returning to this scared child, you know, coming from Poland, I know one thing. I learned, I had to learn my national anthem. I don't know it entirely, but the first line is, Poland is not over yet. This fear that the child has is very much the same. It's like, am I over or not? And, you know, the Ukrainians, given their current situation, especially it's paradoxical, they have very similar first line of the national anthem. However, it is the glory and the glory of Ukraine is not over. So Ukraine is safe. The glory might be there or not, you know. And then the Polish national anthem starts with, Poland is not over yet until we are there. So basically it's conditional. You know, so you have to imagine a Polish person waking up every day, looking through the window and saying, like, is it over or not? You know, and this uncertainty grants, if you look at Polish history, there are moments which are very fascist, but there are moments also of incredible openness and heterogeneity, which is obviously the history that I'm much more comfortable with and in love with, I can say even. So this scared child, this fear, this basic fear can create a very fascist love, and a very fascist art, and a very fascist desire and pleasures, and the exact opposite. And they are so similar. They might proceed in the same ways. So that's my answer to it. It's like, why do we, because I think the current era is very much about what I am and not so much about what the problem is. I think today's discussions, many of them, are about more focused on what positions specific persons participating take rather than the problem. And I think we have to get out of this individualistic, you know, liberal mindset, because it's really killing everything. So if we manage to get out of this mindset in the individualized, we can focus on actual patterns of and needs. And you know, here universalism knocks on our doors, because we discover if we say that our anti-fascist desires and perhaps also fascist desires have very similar structure, have very similar roots. The beginning point is the same. We all live in precarized world, right? Endangered by global catastrophe, in climate, in wars, in everything. So if we see this similarity, and this is a very difficult thing to say, I think, for an anti-fascist who grew up with post-structural theory and thinking, and who is so preoccupied with the difference. You know, accentuating this difference has become the main prerogative of anti-fascism. It's not how we do our anti-fascism, it's how anti-fascist we are. You know, how we are not, how much we are not. I don't care anymore, you know? So this is where universalism kicks in again. It's like, perhaps there are more important things that connect us rather than make my position such a particular and specific. And I think this is the step one for our love. Love is not very, you can love yourself, obviously, as much as you want. But if you want to love anything, anybody else, then yourself. You have to get out of this mindset, me. No? And I think it's a very difficult step in neoliberalism, in which, because I was listening to Gustavo, I was also listening to but I have the direct remark. You were talking so much about this precarized life and this paradox of like, I don't have money. Sorry, I forgot the English version. But there is no money, and how can people believe it? Because we have these. We have our own very solipsistic universes. So there is technology, and I also listened to you, Max. So technology mediates this alienation to levels that would be in the 30s. There would be revolutions going on in most of the countries in Europe right now. No, but with these, we are far more prone to accept political realities that wouldn't be acceptable otherwise. So that's the direct. So I think the role. So I'm very happy to be in the panel together, because I think I'm sorry to say that, but I'm quite proud of what we've gathered here. Like the connections between our talks are important, and I think like with these three narratives we can grasp something. So I'm very happy that you coordinated this way. So I hope I answered to your question in some way. Perhaps also one more thing. So love will be possible, anti-fascist love will be possible if we stop focusing so much on how are we not loving in the same way as fascists. I think this is point one for me.
Thank you. Of course, I didn't have the chance to say this. I found it really very interesting, and exactly what you were just saying. I think the connections that we are seeing are really very powerful and interesting. Maybe, yeah, now that we are on the coming slowly to the kind of question of what strategies, what anti-fascism has to do, Max, I would bring this to you. You already mentioned some of the ideas you have around it, and I completely agree, of course. You know, the question of agency, of how we kind of create spaces, practices, politics that kind of allow us to regain agency is very key. At the same time, we are also arguing in a book which was circulating around, and which is how we actually met each other, which is called Beyond Molotovs, a book on anti-fascist, anti-authoritarian strategies. So we are arguing that we also have to reclaim what we call like utopian energy. Yeah? It's a kind of poetic way of, you know, not saying utopia, but, you know, this something. And I agree, like, okay, so anti-fascism is like tough handwork in the streets and so on and so forth. But I wonder if there's also something in this direction that you're thinking about, you know, because I mean, we talked about or Gustavo mentioned kind of this, what Naomi Klein calls end times fascism, yeah, this no future fascism, and I wonder if kind of having something beyond what is, yeah, this utopian energy, isn't also like something that we should kind of make part of our strategy. So this as an opening point, if you would like to reflect in that direction as well.
Yeah. Yes, I think so. I agree, and I didn't mean to imply that the street fighting comes at the expense of that. I think, but I guess I have a series of complications around that, which are not disagreements. I think on the one hand, many of us in this room have practiced expanding the realm of pleasure and fun and utopian thinking from intellectual and artistic and interpersonal perspectives. And I think that's really important. And, you know, I think for many years, even this city, and in particular this neighborhood, has been a real kind of like hub for that. And people have developed incredible different practices of living together in different forms of community and different forms of loving and finding pleasure and having fun in different sorts of ways, and building different alternative utopias. But the problem I think we're facing as anti-fascists now is that we have some neighborhoods and they have the rest. And I don't know, and I guess the question I have is like, how does then the anti-fascist life that's built here in Berlin, that kind of utopian moment, or also in many of the capitals that that I've called home, where we've been able to create different kinds of communities, play different kinds of games. How does that then translate to the work of depriving fascists of their consolidation of the false majority that's key to their power? Because one of the things that fascism has organized itself around has been a kind of loathful castigation towards our pleasures. And I think this, as Eva was mentioning before, this has targeted trans people specifically as this thing that like the international fascist alliance can absolutely not tolerate. People stepping outside of the rigid frameworks of sort of gender fascism. But I'm curious because I think I contend with this in the book and also as a game designer, which is like at what point does that, how do we then translate, or maybe translate's not the right verb. I'm looking for another verb perhaps, proliferate, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't have it in English, but in any case, how do we proliferate those horizons of pleasure beyond just the communities that we're building? And I know there's lots of experiments doing this, and I think some of them are really collected in that book that you have. And I think also maybe the final thing I would say to this is that there is the kind of the way that we've built these forms of community, these forms of pleasure, these forms of play, these forms of love. But then there's also these that emerge relatively spontaneously in moments of struggle, when people are just like, enough, we cannot handle this, we must have something different. And in the streets, and in the bars after the streets, and in the clubs after the streets, people discover new ways of being and new ways of harvesting that utopian impulse. But then, and here maybe I would say this in the most provocative way, could we imagine, or should we imagine, a party based on the networking of those dissident anti-fascist pleasures? In other words, and maybe the party, I just put that out there as a thing to make everyone angry, but but like what would be the structure that would allow us to build an truly internationalist anti-fascist alliance around enabling us to live the lives we want to live, love the loves we want to love, play the games we want to play in an anti-fascist way? Because otherwise, my fear is that there'll always remain these sort of isolated pockets that either find a home in the cracks in the pavement of an increasingly carceral and solidified fascist capitalist alliance, or they'll only emerge as flashes in these moments of rebellion that are easily suppressed and contained.
Gustavo, you talk about the millets, about the austerity, and you also mentioned that somehow they use also the rhetoric of religious rhetoric to kind of internalize this kind of, or outsourcing this suffering or translating this suffering to the kind of pleasure. So religious kind of rhetoric is important. But what about the gender issues? What about this aspect? Is it kind of has any roles on that or not? And I mean, I just want to mention that Argentina is not just famous for this kind of libertarian anarchism. It's also very famous for the feminism and the kind of the very strong feminist movement. So how can you connect these two together? How feminist movement confronting or resisting this libertarian anarchism and the austerity politics of the millet?
Thank you very much, Firo, for the question. Yeah, so the gender issue is key, in Argentina. It's really key, really key. So I didn't mention that in my presentation, but, it's key for many reasons. And I think, so when we talk about, feminism, libertarianism, a kind of reaction, we have to, or many people, I don't know, tend to think about as a kind of libertarianism or fascist, a kind of backlash movement against the feminist uprising. And I think that is more profound than that. It's deeper than that. First of all, because feminism was very successful to politicize the social reproduction of the society. So feminists had made visible the infrastructure or the structural condition of capitalist reproduction. You know, what capitalists or what neoliberalism want to maintain invisible, I don't know, care, domestic labor, private debts, private indebtedness, the unpaid work, all those, this kind of shadow life of capitalism, this kind of backward of capitalist reproduction, feminists managed to politicize them and make it visible and to say, okay, this is central, this is key to the capitalist reproduction. And in that sense, feminism was the first, so was maybe one of the most important threats to this program of adjustment and neoliberalization and ultra-neoliberalization and precarization of the daily life. Because of that, because the visibilization and the politicization of the infrastructure of capitalist reproduction. At the same time, there was a kind of backlash, let's say, you know, like there was a kind of backlash in the saying that how we can say, you know, like there was a kind of objectification of female and sexual dissident body, and also the libertarian. So there is a kind of promise, you know, for this in this patriarchal capitalism. In which say, so in the sense that if they say, okay, I cannot offer to you a good life, I cannot offer to you, you know, a dignified life, I cannot offer to you, you know, the social condition to, I don't know, carry out your project, to live, you know, in a very, I don't know, decent way, but I could offer you, you know, as kind of phantom possession, as Eva von Radical talk, I cannot offer you those bodies. I can offer you the control over those bodies, the control over those form of protest, the control over the feminized bodies, and that's all. And I think that this, so I don't like the gender question is crucial for those two reasons. It's a kind of phantom possession that try to recover the loss that we had, you know, the loss, the impossibility to get a kind of, I don't know, no precarized life. But at the same time, you know, the gender question is an enemy because feminists, especially in Argentina in 2017, 2018, you know, with this famous green wave, had managed to make visible the infrastructure of capitalist reproduction, you know, had politicized that. And the new fascists, so I think this is something crucial when we talk about familiarism, also the recovery to the family as a kind of private sphere. What they want to, you know, so behind this idea of family, is try to make those conditions, make the politicization of the social structure of capitalism invisible again. Try to reprivatize that in the family, try to reprivatize that in the private sphere. What feminists made visible, they want to make invisible through the family, through the private sphere. And I think this feminism is crucial, not only because of ideological reason, not only because there was a kind of backlash. It's about capitalism, it's about the social reproduction, it's about the possibility of the adjustment or the impossibility of this adjustment. You know? I think this is more structural.
Thank you so much. I would suggest we open the round of questions to you all. Please welcoming your comments and questions and so on. I don't know if we have someone, well.
Thank you very much for your presentations, and I have, like, coming back to this allegory of game, I wanted to say that for me it appears that fascism now is associated with ability or illusion of ability of setting your own criteria, which is of course very like powerful force, you know, when you are giving the illusion, like in your domestic sphere, by suspending of legislation against violence against women, like kind of set your own criteria. At the same time, like let's say leftist forces or democratic forces are always constrained by something like constitutional law. Or, you know, we have this kind of the Grundgesetz or something like that. So I wanted to see how you see possibilities of countering this appeal of fascism, of power of setting your own criteria, which is of course also an anarchic one, within the like democratic or democratic system.
Yeah, thank you so much to all the people that presented. I have a specific question to Gustavo, and maybe the other ones can also comment. That it's about your definition of fascism. That you mentioned that it will be like this activation of social suffering and anxiety. But I want to ask you, like, specifically, isn't it like a social movement, a revolution, or even if I go to protest, also like the activation of social anxieties, etc. And in the end, like, my question would be, like, what will be the difference then of the appealing of this pleasure of fascism with, I don't know, any other kind of social movement or like, I don't know, revolutionary moment? Thank you.
Thank you all. I have a simple question to Max. I didn't get you started. I was saying you quoted someone you don't want to quote, and then I think you omitted the name. So I'm very curious about, saying A but not A in fascism. But actually, to add to that, you also you used the adjective fascistic and said you would elaborate in that. I'm not sure if that was sort of a segue to get into fascization, but by way of replacing fascist, the adjective fascist by fascistic. And then I have a second question that's kind of bigger and probably goes more direct to Eva and Gustavo. Gustavo, you quoted Susan Sontag's essay, Fascinating Fascism. I've been obsessing about this essay for a while now, not least because it was translated twice in German and it always omitted the second half, which is not about Leni Riefenstahl, but by way of starting with a photo book on SS uniforms, claiming to discuss sort of proto-fascist aesthetic by looking at kink, at BDSM. And I'm mentioning that. It seems very ambivalent in a way, she seems ambivalent about it, but it is from 1974, and after that we see the so-called sex wars in the United States, which produced this sort of transphobic feminism, as well as the sort of obsession with, any kind of sex work, butch femme, whatever, the lesbian sex mafia. And we see that today, we see that kind of feminism in bed or as part of fascization. So we do have these kind of enemy feminisms, and I'm very curious, the contradiction is all in play, but I do think that, as in sort of in the discussion of that part, it's not feminist, as I think there was a recent Taz article, again saying, whatever that transphobic feminism is just not feminism, and that's getting it wrong. And I'm not saying that anti-fascist strategy, like we need, like that's clear feminism, but what about that part of contradiction? Yeah. And I guess, you also showed Pasolini's Salo, and the German reception is so much because they erased the title and just used the 120 Days of Sodom, and it became as if that is a film about BDSM when it's in fact a film about torture, the pleasure of torture. And yeah.
I would suggest to have a round of replies and then get back, because there's more people who want to ask questions, but so to not forget. Whoever feels called.
I'm kind of inclined to maybe start, because I think a lot about the battles within feminism, but also I've been thinking about fascist pleasures as kind of, more obvious actually than anti-fascist pleasures. Honestly, I think anti-fascism became specifically scared of pleasure, and based on several steps. So one of them was just traced down by the last person who asked the question. So this kind of anti-sex, sex-negative feminism and phobic feminism, basically. But there is more. There is a certain sexual revolution and liberalization after '68, which later started to be contested in all kinds of ways by women, by feminists, by people who noticed that there is certain age that probably is necessary for consent for sexual. So certain aspects of the sexual revolution have been contested, criticized, and somehow managed to become, I think, a great obstacle to anti-fascist pleasure. So I would make it very. I would like to leave us with that. Yeah, that I'm not contesting these criticisms. Many of them have been to the point or more. So diagnosing the patriarchal within anti-fascist was a necessary step. However, we went that direction without thinking of conceptualizing, leaving our fantasies, let's say. So we left them. We're not like we're leaving them in a sense. They've been abandoned. So then the interesting thing is whether anti-fascist passions, pleasures, desires, loves, all these things are possible after the revision, the post-68 revision. I think we need to think about that a lot. So I would say that the current focusing on transphobia, on sex work phobia, on other phobias is necessary. However, a larger picture should be proposed for all of them to perhaps become understood as elements of a withdrawal from pleasure that I think might be seen as a symptom of withdrawal from agency and kind of sense of direction. And one thing to this question about love, I mean, obviously there is this concept of solidarity, which might ring a bell. It doesn't specifically appeal to pleasures so much. However, this pleasure of like finding yourself among others for a good cause is a pleasure that I would recommend. I think it's fun to have that every now and then. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. Thanks for the opportunity also to clarify those citations and the terminology. I appreciate that because I skipped over it very quickly. The quote comes from Jose Ortega y Gasset, and it's quoted in Alberto Toscano's book Late Fascism, near the beginning. I think it's a useful phrase, although as I mentioned, I don't really find Ortega y Gasset's work particularly useful otherwise. It's sort of a liberal. I think it's from his book Revolt of the Masses, which became a kind of canonical liberal book along with sort of bits of Hannah Arendt around the kind of notion of totalitarianism, which collapses fascism and communism into one kind of anti-liberal bundle. In terms of my conceptualization of fascistic politics, I guess I gravitated to that term because I needed something to distinguish, on the one hand, the explicit ideology of fascists in their various stripes, and then the kind of ideological reservoir on which they draw and to which they appeal, like the set of fascist ideas, sentiments, ideological narratives, and affects that are already existing within liberal, capitalist, and other regimes, but maybe are maybe a little more nascent. So as I mentioned, it's a little bit closer perhaps to the way some people have talked about proto-fascism or the way that Umberto Eco has spoken about fascism, that can eventually consolidate around an actual fascist ideology, a fascist party, a fascist influencer, but are a little more ephemeral than that. And fascization then, for me, becomes a term that interrogates what links those two, how fascistic politics cohere into fascist formations, and then how fascist formations promote fascistic politics. And I think actually in that tension between the actual organized fascists and the sentiments and narratives and feelings they're drawing on, there's actually a huge number of points for our interventions to interrupt that fascization in different ways in different institutions. In terms of questions of the law and the kind of fascist joy of breaking the law, I think this is really, really important because we see all over the world when fascists take power, they both come to power by promising that they're going to enforce the law and often propagandizing the virtue of law enforcement. It's sort of like incessant propaganda of, how wonderful our police are, blah, 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 blah. We're going to get tough on these people who are not following the law, these criminals who are walking free, et cetera, et cetera. And at the same time, these fascists, when they take power, gleefully break the law and show us they're breaking the law. And I think, again, it comes to this fascist jouissance, to use the term that I'm glad you represented, the jouissance, the kind of sick pleasure of transgression. And I think the definition of jouissance that's always very useful is it's a pleasure whose pleasurability comes from the fact that you're not supposed to do it, ultimately. And I think that they signal their power in this moment, and they signal their agency in a world where everyone feels like they're being played, when everyone feels like an NPC. You see Trump, for instance, or all of these guys up there breaking the law, and you're like, this is somebody who knows how to play the game. This is the real player. This is the vivification of the thing that I'm supposed to be and that I've always been denied my opportunity to be in various ways. And I would just maybe close with this anecdote, which is that like a person who had more to do with building the global fascist alliance than almost anyone else, Stephen Bannon, really thinks through games a lot, specifically in this type of transgression, where he has this kind of allegory of what he calls like Dave from accounting, who's like some like dweeby guy who works in accounting in like the Midwest of the United States. And he's like, Dave in accounting just feels like a jlob, like he just feels like a loser. He feels like an NPC in someone else's game. He's working for a big corporation. He's living a life he doesn't like very much. And then Dave from accounting goes and plays World of Warcraft, and he plays, you know, Achilles, the hero. And when Achilles dies in World of Warcraft, everyone worships him, and they're like, wow, Achilles was a great hero. When he's in the game, he actually feels like he's leading the life that he wants to live. Whereas when he's in life, he's leading a life that he feels he somehow got scammed into. And I think that for Bannon, of course, it's organized around the male figure, around the revanchist masculinity, around all sorts of things that are wrong. But I think there's something really revealing there about the kind of agency that he was thinking about when he was crafting the fascist politics that we're in now. He was like, what would it mean to make a fascism that appeals not to Dave from accounting, but to Achilles? And that's a really terrifying and interesting question for us to think about.
Thank you very much for your question. Yeah, this is a key question, you know, because I think that there is the thing, you know, sentiment, feelings, emotion are not left-wing, are not right-wing, but at the same time, they are not neutral. They are loaded by experience. They are loaded by social condition. They are loaded by context. They are loaded by a lot of things, you know. I think that what fascists do with that is to accept them and make you enjoy them, you know, try to reproduce them without, I don't know, like taking into account the causes and the context of that. And at the same time, I wouldn't say that, you know, the task of the left is, I don't know, to reproduce this enjoyment. I don't know if the left need to be sexy or, you know, to make this enjoyment, or I don't know, like to counteract the sexiness of fascism with the other kind of kinky aesthetic, of sexy aesthetic. I don't know. Like, but one of the tasks of, I don't know, to start answering your question is to name the cause of the suffering, to name the cause of the anxiety. That's the first step, and that is something that, you know, in the Argentinian context, or maybe, you know, in other contexts, no, the left didn't do it. You know, they didn't know it, the name. Actually, you know, during the election in 2023, the only one party who talked about capitalism, the only one party who talked capitalism in the media, you know, like in the public debate, was La Libertad Avanza, was the libertarians. So they were talking about capitalism because, you know, they thought capitalism was also, they were saying that capitalism was sexy. They were saying that capitalism, like, as a, I don't know, like a more productive or whatever, you know, economic system in the world. They were the only one who were talking about capitalism. And today, actually, you know, fascists, and today, I don't know, like guys like Elon Musk are the only one who are also talking of that, you know, but maybe in a positive sense, or I don't know, like in a fashionable sense. And to start talking about that, this is a question. Other topic, for example, so I didn't talk here in my presentation, but the inflation was really a issue. And not only an economical issue, but a psychopolitical issue. You know, with inflation, it's impossible for you, you know, to, I don't know, like, to planify your future, you know, to know what will you do the next month, to know if you will pay your rent or not next month, and so on and so forth. So it disorganizes all your life. But also, so inflation kind of create a kind of jungle in the society where the social trust is lost. Because, I don't know, like the consumer think that the seller is scamming him. The seller think that the provider is scamming him. The provider think that the producer is like scamming them. The producer think that the distributor is scamming them. It's a kind of fragmentation of society, as it's impossible to live in this kind of context. It's impossible to live without the possibility to planify your life. And so in this social context where the, I don't know, like the trust or the social trust is gone. And Millet and also the libertarian, they were the only one who named them, who named, the psychopolitical dimension of inflation. This is a very stupid example. So the left wing didn't do it. So not only the Marxist Party, but also the Peronists, the liberal didn't do it. They hide the problem, and I think the first step or the first step is not counterpose a kind of more sexy pleasure to the fascist pleasure, but to start naming the problem by their names, and their names are capitalism, deregulation, precarization, overworking, anxiety, And the fascists name that, but convert them into a joyful thing, convert them into pleasure. And this is not our task. So our task is not convert, our social anxiety or social feeling into pleasure. It's to name the cause. And this is, I really like what you say about, I don't know if the left need to be sexy again or need to be like a pleasure, but I think maybe yes. But the first step is not that. So the first step is to name the cause, not reproduce them. So I forgot your question because it was about fascist, about the text of Susan Sontag. Yes, the text was not about Leni Riefenstahl. Actually, she was talking about camp. But she says something that I find interesting about this like a kinky culture or the take back of like a fascist dress into a very camp culture. But what is really interesting that she say that in Leni Riefenstahl, in Leni Riefenstahl movie, there were a kind of sublimation of this vitalism, sublimation of this kind of fascist vitalism. And I will say there is no sublimation today. So today in this post-utopian fascism, we are witnessing no sublimated fascist trends. There is no sublimation. There is just the display of destruction, that the display of the enjoyment, or maybe just the enjoyment of those destruction. And for Susan Sontag, so talking about Leni Riefenstahl, fascist aesthetic, or so fascist aesthetic need that kind of sublimation. And I think this in the post-utopian world that we are living, this sublimation is something that belongs to the past. Yeah, I don't know if it was connected to your question, but
Thank you so much. So I will open. I was seeing like a couple more hands, well, many more hands actually. Okay, I'll hand this to you, and then you can, and then.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you about these specific characteristics that you brought up as being new, because I suspect that, when you compare it to 20th century fascism, you compare it to a specific period of fascism. For example, about decentralization, well, for most of the 1920s, for example, in Germany, there are multiple fascistic groups, not just the Nazis. And within the Nazis, there are different kind of groups. So it is very decentralized for a long time. So after it comes to power, of course, it eliminates all the others, right? With regard to utopia, well, I mean, there was big inflation between 1920, 1923, or 4, and then up from 1929, right? So you only have 4 or 5 years of non-inflationary economics in Germany. And that is pretty much a lot of cultural pessimism and this kind of idea that we're going down, and this idea of Götterdämmerung. So, and that's still alive, actually, comes back with the war, right? So I'm also not convinced about that being new, per se. And with regard to masculinity, of course, I mean, let's not forget Ernst Röhm, right? And his kind of fascistic homosexual band, which then, right, I mean, gave rise to all kinds of Frankfurt School kind of theories on fascism and so on. But even before that, I mean, going back all the way to Hans Blüher, Wandervogelbewegung, this kind of Männerbund ideology, man bonding together, this kind of homosociality, not sexuality per se, being at the foundation of a strong state and a strong nation and warfare and strength. right? And that, of course, with a lot of kind of homosexual erotics attached to it. Again, that goes even beyond Hitler or the NSDAP. Considering these kind of aspects, again, I would would like to invite you to sort of specify a bit more what is really new, except for, of course, the social media and all that technology. Thank you.
Yes, okay. I was wondering, so I was really thinking about pleasures in a very literal sense, or to an extent, how we are maybe overstating the importance of a feeling of pleasure, and whether it's more that the right is better in engaging certain very innate urges or needs that we have as human beings, especially when I'm thinking about community, than the left is. Because we do have protests, and then everyone gets very energized and motivated and excited, and they're locked into an issue. I think, for instance, about those protests against the far right that we had in Germany after Friedrich Merz's comments about the Brandmauer, or against the genocide in Gaza, and then you have this moment of, oh, finally something is happening and it's so energizing, and then you want to do something, but the only option that you have left is to go into like some group and talk about it, overanalyze shit over and over and over again. And there's nothing in between, there's nothing, I mean, I'm overgeneralizing, I'm frustrated, right? But there's no in between, in the sense of where can I make the sandwiches so some people can like lock themselves up in front of some, I read once a book about how in the civil rights movement, that there was this quote that I found very inspiring, in the sense that this wouldn't have worked if there weren't like thousands of women who are like just making the sandwiches. And that this very hands-on, getting dirty type of activism is not institutionalized enough, maybe in left-wing spaces, while the right has those white nationalist churches that do that very well, or Beatrix von Storch has her aristocratic like circles that meet every 2 months somewhere in Thuringia, and this sounds like my personal version of hell, but it works. And why is there this gap between like those over-analytical talking circles and then those demonstrations that emotionalize us, but in between there's nothing, and how do we build that?
My question comes from something you were saying, but of course anyone can respond to it. You were talking about some kind of latent fascism that also lingers in our anti-fascist friends, and you were also hailing the anti-fascist neighborhoods here around in Berlin. And for me, one of the biggest experiences of the last 2.5 years was also that a lot of the connections that I built here also over the last 10 years, and connections that seemed really strong and where I felt we are unified in our common pleasure in that all people are equal, and that we meet eye to eye, and that we organize eye to eye, and this is somehow something we want to achieve as an internationalist community here that forms, and that can also only form in a big city, it seems. Yet it crumbled really fast in the face of the Palestine question. I don't say this is like the main issue where this shows, but it's one of the big issues where this showed in the last years, and where really alliances were also breaking. And we were actually also organizing around a party like one you were imagining, that brought everything to this breaking point in the end. And the DIY party is somehow over now, so I don't see the salvation in the party anymore. But I think it's really interesting to look into this. What is it in us that draws also us, but also the people who are close to us, to fascist pleasures? And can you look a bit more into this, like the latent fascism in our friends, but also in ourselves?
I would have a question going to Max and to Gustavo, because when I look on your relation that you analyze, one part was to say, okay, we see Millet coming up, but with a more materialist approach on looking how Millet came into power, the support of Heritage Foundation, the Atlas Network, that was popping up Millet as a yeah, as a scholar, then as a radio host, then as a candidate for parliament, then in the parliament, then becoming president, and setting up the structure for his success, being financed by right-wing think tanks from the US and global support, even up to Friedrich Naumann Stiftung from Germany. And when we link this to the analysis of Max that I've seen as a part of the existing fascism, in the sense of course, the CIA-backed fascist governments and put in place right-wing leaders to save capitalism and American globalist imperialism in countries in South America, but also in Southeast Asia and others, in Africa. So if we combine these two analyses, I think we have a lack, and our own analysis lacks the material dimension, that we are facing a global fascist structure that is propped up by right-wing think tanks globally, yeah, neoliberal right-wing think tanks that come together in the Milei project, and we see the dependency of Milei up to Besson saving a week before the election to step in to bail out Argentina and Milei, because it's so important to have such a figure for a right-wing project that pretends itself as futuristic, utopistic. And when we would come to a more materialist analysis, I would say we miss out on the dimension that fascism is sexy because it finances influencer, it pays Turning Point USA 100 millions, you get rich, you get audience, you get support, and yeah, what would you say more on the materialist analysis? Because then we would also have another answer, meaning we have to fight back more on a structural level with own think tanks, with our own strategy of organizing, with unions, parties, and structures, to question also the authoritarian turn in tech companies that are a mirror of this fascistization that you described.
My question is for Eva. I think you said something like, the scariest thing to them is a gay guy who looks and acts like them, and is also a CEO. I'm not sure if I heard that right, but in case I heard it right, the first thing I thought of was Peter Thiel, and why do they seem to accept and even love him so much? I'm not sure if that was something that you think or something you quoted, and I just wanted to hear what your thoughts are on this. Like, do they just accept him because and as long as he's useful, like Alan Turing? Or do they love him despite or because they're scared of him, or something completely different?
Thank you. And I would hand the mics that you already have in hand to you.
So very quickly, I think that I'm going to use what Max was elaborating, the contradictions of fascism and the kind of, ultimate power that and reasons that. Let me enjoy the French words as well. The perverted reasons, deeply perverted reasons, in running all kinds of narratives that totally collapse, contradict each other and sublate each other and do whatever kind of what contradictions do within one fascist narrative. So I believe that this is possible as well. So there is beloved gays and there is like the hate. Also, hate can coexist here. So the gay people in power that we might see today enjoying this power, tomorrow might be objects of hate. We will see. So I'm kind of also warning about this kind of temporality, short-lived temporality very often of those groups who emerged to get some rights, but those rights might be taken away. I mean, as a woman from Poland, I can tell you that, we enjoyed reproductive rights throughout the state communism. And what now? We have to come here to do abortions and take day after pills and things like that, and that's important. So to the person from over there who was talking, I would like to say that you were combining, you were putting together Gustavus and Max talk, which is fine and great, and it gave you good results. However, I'm thinking that there was something missing in this conjuncture, which was basically the reason, like what drives all this? What kind of desire? What kind of fantasy is organizing? Why these and not those influencers? Why the fascist influencers somehow seem to gain so much more money than the other ones? And then I want to tap in something that you, Max, said about the party. You mentioned that perhaps the party. I'm going to irritate everybody here much more, because my next book, which is called The Caring Eyes of Leviathan, I like the title, so I want to share. Also, so it's basically based on a queer studies research in archive of a police operation targeting gay men in Poland of the 80s. And as this operation has never been in any way summarized, judged, like nothing happened, basically. So then we had a wave of homophobia in Poland, I think somehow rooted in the fact that there was another police operation never punished. So now current politicians also think they can, go after LGBTQ AI plus people with no consequences. So I'm kind of suggesting not only that somebody goes after these guys from the past, but also I'm suggesting that perhaps we need a queer theory of the state. Because in the course of my 10 years research on these police operations targeting gay men, I realized that a large part, the majority of queer theory, has resigned from something that I find pretty crucial for it, which is a responsibility not necessarily to the LGBTQA plus persons or groups, but to the interest. So I'm using the Marxist terms to maybe joy of Gustavo. And I'm thinking there should be, if we talk socially, politically, queer theory, there should be a responsibility over there. And I think it was lost. And I want to reconstruct it. And, so projecting this specific context of LGBTQAI plus interests and theory, I think we should spread it onto feminism, Marxism, everything. Like Marxism became academic discipline. I think Karl Marx is crying in his grave.
Yes, so the two questions about what is new and what is old. I think this is a really key question, but I don't know if the question is good, like formulated. I don't know if it's an important question, because we can number a lot of things that are new. I don't know, like social media, the possibility, I don't know, like the desire for authenticity and the possibility to produce fake authenticity every day. So I don't know, like the blurry of differentiation between economy and politics, between regime, I don't know, like a political regime and block of power. Also, I don't know, like the financialization of subjectivity that maybe it wasn't present in the in the original, on the historical fascists. I don't know. So maybe we can find a lot of new things and a lot of reproduction of all things. One thing I like to think about, or maybe in a context, maybe it's new or not, I don't know, like is this post-utopian war. I remember a sentence of Daniel Ben Said in a very beautiful memory of the past. So a very beautiful book. He say, okay, the 19th century started with the idea of progress. This has this utopian idea of progress. The 20th century started with the idea of revolution. It was really a pregnant idea, not only for communists, but also for fascists. But the 21st century started the idea that we are really fucked up. And this is no utopia there. And, maybe this post-utopian is something new. I don't know, like maybe you can say the Gottendämmerung is a kind of, but maybe it's better if we don't, I don't know, for me, if we think of fascism not in terms of new and old, but in terms of specters, in terms of kind of breaking of the present that reproduce itself, that appear as kind of ghost. So in terms that Derrida talk about Marx, for example. So Marx was not old, but it was not new. It was a kind of a spectrum that counts the present and also is repeating and reproducing all parameters within new context and try to breaking up the present. I don't know, like I don't know. So maybe it's good or not. I'm not an historian, and I don't like that kind of discussion about analogy. This is not the historical fascist. This is the new fascist. Really, I think this is really, I don't know, unproductive, at least for me. But try to think about spectrum, or that's something that come from the past within no context, with all stuff, with all dress, and that try to play with that. I think it's more productive for me. Because if we want to I don't know, find new or all things, we can find everywhere. This is not the discussion, and at least for me. And about this support by foundation, this I don't know, geopolitical background, or this really network that were back in Millet. I don't know, like a Heritage Foundation, the Koch brother, and whoever. Yeah, this is really important, and it was really important, for example, in the last middle-term election in Argentina, when Trump intervened like he did in Venezuela, but say, okay, I will back Millet. If Millet won't win, you will die. So he said that, and the people say, okay, I don't want to die, I will vote for Millet, because it's kind of, like a kind of blackmailing. But I don't think that this is enough to explain, like fascism, or, to explain Millet victory. because because the liberal and the traditional party had more money and spent more money in the political campaign than Milei did. And also, I don't remember when triangulation in 2015, it was against Hillary Clinton. The whole Silicon Valley was supporting Hillary Clinton. So Trump, of course, so Peter Thiel was supporting him, but Trump was kind of outsider. The money was was in favor of Hillary Clinton by them, of the liberal. The same happened in Argentina. Even when they have, or even when Milei have a Heritage Foundation backing him, also the money has of, Mauricio Macri and the Peronists had more money in the campaign than Milei had. I don't know if, so that is explained partially, but there is something like, kind of connection between the libertarian agenda and the, social and political sensibility that I think this more, or is I don't know if we say it's more accurate, but it's complementary to say, because I don't want to deny the meaning and the importance of that kind of, financial structure. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for all the questions. I'm going to try and answer them swiftly, but hopefully with some satisfaction. I want to pick up on what you were saying and echo it in a slightly different language around this question of the think tanks and the very materialist forces. And I think that's very true. I didn't mention them, for my part, mostly because I assume that most people in this room would be vaguely familiar with them. And I'm a cultural theorist rather than primarily a political economist. So my interest is, yes, of course, in these questions about like where's the money come from and what do they want. But I'm interested in two other things as well. And one of them is these, I think as you were alluding to, this money is used to prey on certain sentiments that are already there. And I'm interested in what soil exists in which fascist seeds grow. If these are, if we imagine these as kind of propagators, these think tanks as planting these seeds, what are the conditions under which those seeds grow and what are the conditions under which they don't grow? Second of all, I would say that, again, picking up on your points, I feel like right now the capitalist class is in a deep, protracted international crisis. And there are many different factions among them, some of whom are fascist, some of whom are semi-fascist, some of whom want the old type of liberalism. And so also part of the materialist analysis is paying attention to those tensions and where we might be able to take advantage of them as both anti-capitalists and anti-fascists. And I think that's really interesting. I think similarly, this might come back to the question of, very briefly, about Peter Thiel, who I think is a really fascinating figure, I agree. Because there are major splits, specifically within American fascism, but also global fascism around figures like this. And if you listen to, for instance, Steve Bannon's as like a very influential fascist figure, is kind of at war with Thiel at various moments. They work together sometimes, they work against each other sometimes. So I think we can pay very close attention to where the fissures are between these different figures and start to realize where the fascist alliance starts to break down, both within nations and between nations. What's new and what isn't? I mean, I also agree. I think it's probably better to say that things are both new and not new. There's a very interesting book by Samir Gandesha called Spectres of Fascism, actually, yeah, which is I think does a good job of explaining this. I want to briefly elaborate what I see as new, because I think it will bring us back to those questions of political economy. For me, it's not so much like what are the features of fascism that are new, but what, again, is the difference in the soil in which fascism is trying to plant itself or successfully planting itself. And for me, I'm thinking about the difference between 20th century fascism in both Italy and Germany that preyed upon a highly militarized, industrialized society, and the 21st century forms of capitalism that are much more decentralized, user-generated, neoliberal, competitive, and in many ways exploit us through our agency rather than through our obedience, let's say. And so I think my attempt to understand fascism now is not to say like all of these things are all new, but the political economic situation is different, and therefore the appearance of these fascist specters might take a new form in that moment. And then maybe finally, I would just echo the points at the back that I think really one of the things that fascism offers is not just pleasure, but also just, I wouldn't necessarily say community, but a momentary escape from alienation. In the same way that like eating fast food isn't going to give you nutrition, but it will give you a temporary alleviation from hunger that might have horrible effects later on. I think that fascism is always really specialized in offering this feeling of like communitas without the actual substance of what community means, because community means difference. Community means having to do the constant work of solidarity, of putting up with people you can't stand and that you don't want to be sexy to, or that you don't want to have to be in a meeting with. That's the stuff that fascism can't contend with. They have to produce this illusion of wholeness and this sensation without substance of an illusion of community, and as a constantly receding horizon. And that's why it constantly needs enemies, because it constantly needs to say, we have not arrived at the community yet because of blank. And when they're done with the first enemy, they'll slaughter the second enemy, and they slaughter the third enemy until, perhaps no one is left, or they start a nuclear war. And that's, I think, the full terror of what fascism does, because it's a kind of, to use the Buddhist term, a hungry ghost, the worst kind of hungry ghost imaginable, addicted to its own destruction constantly, and the destruction of ever more enemies that it has to produce. And then finally, I just want to echo your point that I think we do have exactly the problem that you mentioned. You're either out on the streets, fighting the cops and the Nazis, or you're in this room talking about jouissance. And there's not a huge amount in between. And when I do workshops with my collaborator, Sarah Stein-Lubrano, doing movement education, a lot of what we're doing with movements is just helping think through, like, how do you recruit people? Yes, indeed, by saying what the problem is. And yes, indeed, by saying, like, yeah, this can be fun and you can find a community here, but also through actions. Our minds change through our actions. They don't change through rhetoric primarily. They don't change through reason. They don't change through arguments. They change by doing. And getting someone to come to some place and make a sandwich is far more influential than getting them to sit here for hours and listen to us talk about all of the important things we need to talk about. I'm not anti-intellectual, obviously. I'm just saying that, like, as movements, I really do feel like we need to think again about agency and how to make people feel like they're useful, like they're part of something, like they're coming together with other people in all of its complexity and difficulty. So yes, sandwiches. Yeah.
I know there's still some questions, but I would call it an evening. I thank you so much also, Max, that you managed. I always hate it when people think we have to end in an optimistic or positive way, but you did it, you ended powerfully, which I really appreciate a lot. Thank you all so much for being with us. I hope you liked it. I loved it a lot. Thanks to you. Well, one handful of the panel.